I'm happy to introduce Jeff Biggers to all of you. Jeff is an award-winning historian, journalist, and playwright. His stories have appeared on National Public Radio International, and several publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Atlantic Monthly. A noted historian, playwright, and journalist, Jeff is the writer of several books, including The Trials of a Scold, the incredible true story of writer Anne Royal. In their review, Publishers Weekly praises Biggers as a lively and witty chronicler and calls the book captivating and thoroughly researched. His new book is called Resistance, Reclaiming an American Tradition. As Biggers shows in this people's history of social justice activism in America, the nation was founded on resistance. Using Thomas Paine's rousing common sense as his model and point of departure, Biggers chronicles centuries of freedom movements from the Revolution to the defeat of fascism during World War II, from early Native American and immigrant struggles to the abolitionists and women's suffrage advocates, and on to the civil rights movement, LGBTQ activism, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and more. Putting the anti-Trump struggle on this longer continuum, Biggers, the award-winning author of the United States of Appalachia, reminds us how essential and successful resistance has been in overcoming threats to our freedom, a tradition he charges us to continue. Publishers Weekly, in their review of the book, calls it well-informed and often witty. Biggers succeed in showing how the long tradition of resistant movements continue today. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Biggers.
What a great turnout! A microphone. I have never used a microphone in my life. You know, I come from 200 years of tent revival speakers in the theater. Do I need to use the microphone? Yeah. Oh my God. I'm not going to be able to use this either because I have to put my book down. So I'll just put this here. And I'll move over here. So you need me to be here? Yes. I'm going to resist. I see Courtney's baby. And that is so amazing to me. It's like the 18th reading for this little child. She's 6 months old. So, I mean, how many readings can you go? And I see this front line of resistance. You know, these are my people. These are the kind of people that I want to read to. And this is beautiful, going from the ages of us to ages down to Courtney's baby to everybody in the back. And Marty here, he's been to every single reading of every book. And is that not the definition of a great friend, you know, to suffer through all this? So I want to thank you for having me at Politics and Prose. What an amazing bookstore. As I was told by my friend here, this is the best bookstore, not only in Washington, but you're going to find on the East Coast. And everyone give a big hand to Politics and Prose. And you all are lucky tonight. You are so lucky because, you know, you don't have to raise your hands, especially you in the front row, but I know someone here has slipped sometime and done the click and ordered on Amazon, and you don't have to raise your hand if you've ever done that. But tonight is your opportunity to atone for your sins. And we have a simple policy here. For every time you have sinned and you have gone and done that click or a double click, or God forbid, you've even gone on and done other things we don't even want to talk about, you can buy an extra book tonight. And that's what we have to do. These bookstores are the foundations of our community. If we're going to resist, we need to resist an economy that takes our money out of town. We have to resist an economy that is kind of not building our community, but breaking our community. And I really want you, when you buy books, and when you buy albums, when you buy, as my little son says, I want you to think about your local bookstores, because this is where it's at. This is the community. This is a great gathering spot, and we really need to support local independence today. So let's try to atone today. All right, I'm going to try to be around this microphone, but it's going to be really hard because usually I walk around and involve people and kind of like, we'll see here. Let them call me rebel and welcome. I feel no concern for it. But I should suffer the misery of devils were I to make a whore of my soul by swearing allegiance to one whose character is that of a sottish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish man. Now, no, that's not who you're thinking about. Put those dark thoughts away. That was written in a dark moment of our American Revolution by a man who gave us our name, the United States of America. I almost said the United States of Appalachia. I was in Appalachia last night. By Thomas Paine, who said, now is the time that we begin to understand who we are as an Americans. And now is the time that we begin to call in ace and begin the process of our resistance and to create our democracy. And it was an incredible time. It was a dark time. You know, today is a dark time, and, you know, cover the ears of that poor little child who's 6 months, because think of the news we wake up to daily, and all of us wake up, you know, to someone, or we wake up to our horrible phone, and we can't even face it until we have our first cup of coffee, wondering, what did he put on there today? And we think, God, it's never been darker than now. To pick up the newspaper today and realize that only 4 kids out of thousands have been reunited with their immigrant parents today, breaking a promise, Department of Justice and Homeland Security. That my profession is now referred to as enemies of the people, and I still feel for 5 people in Maryland and their families who were gunned down because we've been referred to as people who are somehow attacking democracy. And we're under threat as journalists. The times are so dark when we see the EPA, you know, and somehow we want to celebrate the removal of Scott Pruitt. And then I realize, oh my God, the new head of the EPA is someone I've been fighting for 10 years as a journalist covering the coal fields and the coal wars. One of the worst coal barons, lobbyists now in charge. And we saw in the New York Times, don't tell the Washington Post, we saw in the New York Times that 67 major environmental regulations have been reversed. It's dark times. Climate change. That yesterday, from Canada down to South America, from Oman to Australia, we broke record heat. That we're entering a period of irreversible destruction. That Puerto Rico is getting flooded. It's dark times. And it's hard. It's hard to understand what to do. And as I was driving in from the Shenandoah today, and I go by George Mason University, and I'm thinking, what would George Mason do? George Mason walked out of the Constitutional Convention. He refused to sign the Constitution, one of 3 people. Our forgotten founder, the man who put life, liberty in the pursuit, he said, let's put happiness, because he had already used it in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1775. This man who enslaved people, but said, until we stop slavery, we'll never create a nation. And therefore he refused to sign our Constitution because it included the right to own people for another 20 years. But most importantly, George Mason refused to sign that Constitution because he said, if we give the president the right to pardon, it will lead to an aristocracy and a monarchy ultimately that we can't control. And I woke up and opened the newspaper today, and I realized the inhabitant of 1600 Pennsylvania, which I went down, I tried to give him a copy of my book, but it didn't work. Today pardoned 2 arsonists from Oregon, heroes of the white supremacist movement, who led to a takeover of a federal building using weapons and acts of violence. And yet they were pardoned today by our president. And what? Yeah, the baby, man, she's already into this. What would George Mason do in these dark times? You know, we often talk about the revolution. And I think most kids today, last week we had July 4th, and And we all put up our flags and we march in the streets, and the real estate developers go around in their convertibles, at least in my Iowa town, and everyone thinks that's what July 4th. We think we had July 4th, 1776, and the next day we went to the shopping mall and everything was half off, and that was our American Revolution. And we don't realize that the revolution went on for years and it went bad. That we reached a stalemate in the North. And George Washington struggled, this failed military leader. He wasn't able to pull it off. He was having mutinies. He was actually having to execute people because of the mutinies. He was realizing there weren't resources, that the colonial elite talked well, but they wouldn't back it up. There was no backbone. That in fact there were secret negotiations to give the North to the Americans and give the South to the British. And just think about that for a moment, of what that would have done to our country music legacy. That the times went bad. And the times had always gone bad. And it reminds me a lot of today, of a Congress without a backbone, that even after the executions of our American patriots there in Concord and Lexington, the shots heard around the world. Our Continental Congress came together to write a declaration, and they said in 1775, we kind of want, maybe, if it's okay with you, we kind of would really like to be independent, but if it irritates you, then we'll accept reconciliation. I know, it's pissing me off too, that kid. She's getting into it. John Hancock signed that. The Olive Branch Declaration. John Hancock signed a lot of declarations. And onto this scene came this undocumented immigrant. Dregs of society. He was twice in debt, twice broken marriage. He was wanted. He couldn't even make it as a tax collector in England. How low can you get? He hadn't had 4 or 5 bankruptcies like somebody else. But he was a failure. And he couldn't even make the boat trip. He spent the boat trip, sick, and they took him off the boat and on a stretcher. And he just happened to have a letter from Benjamin Franklin, someone he had ingratiated himself and was able to come in. And this undocumented immigrant couldn't believe, because he had come in 1775 to celebrate what America was supposed to be, this land of independence, this land of resistance. And he found all these young people in Philadelphia who really wanted to buck the system, were being held back. Not by you on the front lines, but they are held back by other people. An older colonial elite who wanted to go slow, a colonial elite that had scolded the Boston Tea Party. And we forget the Boston Tea Party was not popular until 1830s. That Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter saying, you bad people, you should really pay for that tea. And this undocumented immigrant began to wonder, what is going on with this country? This is not why I immigrated here. And he did what all people, if you can't find a job, is what you do. You start your own magazine. So he started his own magazine. And he published a poem, a beautiful poem by Phyllis Wheatley, one of our most beautiful and beloved poets, an enslaved woman who said, you understand, I resist tyranny because you have taken me from my beloved Africa. And she wrote a poem praising this young general who was emerging named George Washington, and she sent it to him, and George Washington sent a letter back, not knowing that this was an African American, a woman who was enslaved, and he said, thank you so much, I will always be your humble servant. And her property owners, doesn't that word make you cringe, actually freed her because of how important Phyllis Wheatley was to our revolution. And Thomas Paine continued to write, and of course, he eventually publishes The Common Sense on January 10th, 1776, which actually says, now is the time that we have to begin thinking about this independence movement. How can a little island, which you have this brutish leader wreaking havoc on mankind, control the rest of the world? That we have it in our power to invent the world again. He publishes it. 100,000 copies go out. It's still today, second to the Bible, the most read document in the United States. It was read aloud at the squares, at the Liberty Trees. It was read by barns and under trees. It was read at the dockyards. And of course, the biggest rabble, the leaders of the resistance were African Americans and people who worked in the dockyards. people who had already led the riots in Boston and New York City and gone on to Philadelphia. And George Washington said, this is changing the minds of our nation. Even John Adams, this wonderful man, of course, he was kind of a quasi-Unitarian, so he must have been a good man. And he couldn't believe, he said, this is almost too democratical. We have to be careful of this person. But it was too late. And within 6 months, we declared our independence, or at least, 200 of old white men declared their independence. And we had our revolution in the beginning. And it didn't go well. It didn't go well. Within months, Washington said, I think the game is pretty well up. No one was putting money, no one was having resources, we were having mutinies. Thomas Paine kept writing and nothing was happening. He put aside his pen and grabbed up his musket. He joined the front line. And still, we realized it wasn't going to happen, that the Brits had brought us to a stalemate easily. I tremble for Philadelphia, I tremble, Washington said. He begged Paine to go back and do something else, that in fact he had changed America already with this concept of common sense, that could he do something else for us? And so Tom Paine went back to Philadelphia, skirting the British troops. And he gets there, and he begins in this passion of patriotism to write another document that would change us forever. He begins on December 19th, 1776. These are the times that try men's souls. I was doing a reading a year ago for Writers Resist, and I was doing it with a Gambian-American young woman, a Muslim student, and I began to do that. These are the times that try men's souls. And then I realized this woman walks onto the stage, and she just casually pushes me off, and she said, dude, these are the times that always try women's souls. So we must change it. These are the times that try our souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of the country, but he that stands by it now, she that stands by it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and all women. Tyranny, my friends, like hell, is not easily conquered, and yet we have the consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. The great mythology, of course, and we don't know if it's true or not, but let's pretend it's true because it's a great story, that in fact, 4 days later, Washington gets this document. It's taken throughout the country. He gathers his troops that are freezing in New Jersey. Not sure what exit at New Jersey, but somewhere in New Jersey. And they read it around the campfire. And the next night they march. And the next night they cross the Delaware. And they attack the Brits and the Hessian mercenaries, and they defeat them for the first time ever. And it turns the tide of the American Revolution. And that John Adams, who once again detested this commoner, who is this man? He's too democratical. He wrote begrudgingly in his diary that we are going to ascribe the American Revolution to that Thomas Paine, and not us, because it was the pen of Paine and not the sword of Washington that won our American Revolution. Amazing story. And here in Washington, D.C., a town I love, a town that I embraced when I was a teenager just a few years ago. It's funny, they didn't know what to do with me. I was out in rural Arizona, and they said, why don't we send you to a nice little Quaker school, and you can learn from the Quakers. And I said, hey, that sounds good. And so they sent me to Sidwell Friends. And that joke didn't really work very well. Sidwell Friends is not particularly a Quaker school. And here I was at Sidwell, and I didn't know what to do, and I was virtually illiterate, and I was very overwhelmed, and so I spent the whole day working on the Hill as an intern. And my job was to drive around Mo Udall, Congressman Morris Udall, because of course his Parkinson was really affecting old Mo. And so as a 17-year-old, I would drive him, and then I would go to his gigs, and I would hold his water or coffee. But the beautiful thing was to be in the car and hear his stories. You know, he was too funny to become president, he said. And he had one joke after another. And he was someone who struggled with a lot of things. We fought like cats and dogs because he supported gun rights coming from Arizona. He supported taking away part of the lands of the Navajo nations that we were fighting at that point. He supported, watering down the strip mining bill that ultimately would affect my people from the coal fields. But Mo was an extraordinary character of integrity. And it was a beautiful time to be in Washington. It was the spring of 1981 when if you think it's dark today, the towers of Saron and darkness had come back to Washington in the guise of this smiling actor who took over the White House. And it was really amazing. I'm going to talk about 4 things tonight. All right, I'll get to the point. She's like, come on, hurry up, bud. So I'm going to talk about 4 aspects of protest and resistance, because what is resistance? I'm not here to talk about protest. Protest, to me, is one form of resistance, but that's not the only form of resistance. I had to go through a radio program today, and the radio reviewer, I always love it when they're really prepared, he said, well, so tell me about the riots in 1968. And I don't know anything about the riots. So, what riots in 1968? You want to talk about, Detroit or where? And I said, I'm talking about resistance. But there's another definition. What do we mean by resistance? Is it just protesting? We have that Google is now leading the resistance we saw last year. And Starbucks on sale for $2.99 is leading the resistance. And everybody was part of the resistance. One of the Kardashian girls, was going to have a Coke bottle. And she made this commercial where she was going to bring the resistance to the police on the front line. And nobody would have that, And the resistance almost became this washed out thing within 5 minutes. What is this resistance? When I think of the resistance, I think of these guys with, berets in Paris, fighting the Nazis. Or I think of the Tiananmen Square tank men, and incredibly standing up to what was happening in China. And I think of so many different women. But the resistance is who we are. And the first thing I want to talk about is Thomas Paine said it's a fundamental credo that we have to reframe the concept of resistance, that in fact, it's our patriotic duty to resist duplicitous civil authority and authoritarian spasms that threaten our democracy. That it's the most patriotic thing you can do. It's not that we're attacking some orange hair blonde monster on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's that we're defending his attack on our democracy. And we reframe it in that way that, in fact, on July 4th, we're reclaiming that flag is our flag, a flag that defends the right of democracy and the seeds of resistance that we began in 1776 and long before 1776, that, hey, we've been resisting for 500 years in the Americas. That in 1619, when the first settlement was happening in Jamestown, won't talk about Roanoke, when Jamestown in 1619, within 2 months, the Polish workers who had been brought to do the glass blowing went on strike because they weren't given the rights to vote, and they won. And Angelo and 20 other enslaved Africans who began the abomination of slavery in our corporate system began to resist. And within 2 years, the Padawan attacked and resisted. That resistance has been part of this fundamental credo, but importantly, as Paine said, it's a patriotic duty. No, it's a patriotic must, that you must resist an attack on our democracy. And I'm going to think about Marty and Oon today, these incredible journalists who are sitting back there. In 1798. They weren't here in 1798. I remember it well in 1798. John Adams was the president. John Adams wanted to be called His Highness or His Greatness. And Abigail Adams, is always, kneecapping him and trying to bring it down a tone. And Abigail Adams said, how come you didn't include women in the Declaration? And how come you don't include women in the Constitution? How dare you? And John Adams, of course, these lofty New Englanders, and God forbid we attack John Adams because Anthony Hopkins played him in that amazing movie. So if you have Anthony Hopkins, then how you can't attack him? But he's called His Highness, and the journalists didn't call him His Highness. They referred to him as His Rotundity. And when he finally became president in 1798, he began to collude with our former enemy. I'll repeat that. He began to collude with our former enemy. Oh dear. And we found out from journalists that the Brits had actually put thousands of dollars into our election without us knowing. Oh dear. And that suddenly he's sending off Jay. What is it, James J? I forget, there's that building in New York. Is James J? John Jay. John Jay goes over and does this treaty, the Jay Treaty, which is a betrayal because it basically gives first trade status, oh dear, first trade status to our former enemy, completely turning our backs to France, who in fact won our American Revolution for us. Holland's Lafayette. And the journalists began to investigate what's going on here, that John Adams is giving jobs to his family members, you know, Ivanka Adams and her son-in-law. And things are all going wrong, and they begin to criticize Adams, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't like dissent, and he has a very thin skin with his rotundity, and he passes the law, the Sedition Act of 1798. And I shall read it to you because it's really a beautiful part of our American history. I've reached that age now where I can't read with or without my glasses. To write, print, utter, and publish, or cause it to be done, or assist in it in any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government of the United States, or either the House of Congress, or the President, His Highness. This was now a crime that you could be imprisoned with. You could not attack the government or the president. And so the next day, the journalists put up on the front page, you know, you could see it right there. Everybody went to their iPhones and were clicking, and they could see the Constitution on one side and this Sedition Act on the other, and the great Anne Greenleaf. How many great women journalists, of course, we had. And you know that here in Washington because you know you had Catherine Ann Goddard. You know, she had 3 names, so she had to be important. Catherine Ann Goddard, who published the Declaration of Independence here in Baltimore, was a great journalist in the 1770s. And these journalists began to go after this ridiculous attack on our democracy. Our First Amendment right, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. I would cry too. They began to imprison people. They went after Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was Benjamin Franklin's grandson, who had been educated abroad, and he came back and he couldn't believe it, and he wrote these scathing articles. He created a newspaper that was a muckraker called the Aurora, and they went for the jugular going after him. But first off, there was this congressman up in Vermont. It's always a congressman up in Vermont who's bothering us. His name is Matthew Lyons, and he had a great newspaper. It was called The Scourge of Aristocracy. I want to start that blog, you know, The Scourge of Aristocracy, which made sense because John Adams, and he met this young cat named Alexander Hamilton who wanted to be a Broadway star, but he was 200 years too early. And they said, hey, you know, there's the few and the many in the United States, and the few should control the many. You know, John Adams wanted to create a House of the Lords. And there was reasons why that. He said, hey, the only way we can control aristocracy is to give them some power. You know, John Adams was not entirely bad. Just Anthony Hopkins really embellished it well. So the journalists went after it. They began to attack. Benjamin Franklin Bache was imprisoned. He was released. He died of yellow fever. They put other journalists in prison. Another man came and took Bache's position. He became the editor of the newspaper, the Aurora. He married his wife, which I guess the paper came with the wife and he got married. And then my hillbillies, you know, wonderful people from Virginia and Kentucky began to do the same. We had the Great Covenant of Lexington, and they began to challenge this ridiculous law. Thomas Jefferson couldn't believe it. He said, we're living in the reign of witches. And I fear and tremble for my nation. It's only the journalists who are going to arrest the march to monarchy. So the journalists did not just report the resistance. The journalists led the resistance. So when you bump into Jeff Bezos at a coffee shop one of these days, mention that to him. Because within 1 year, with journalists in prison and still defying it, doing a cat and mouse game, we had the election of 1800. Jefferson won, and the Sedition Act was finally taken away. But the resistance won on behalf of democracy. And this is an amazing story of journalism. Not that we are partisan, but we bring the truth out of the light. What Gene Roberts, the great New York Times editor who was from the South and was sent down as a young man to cover the civil rights movement. I'm not here to cover the civil rights movement. I'm here to bring the truth out of the darkness and tell you a story of what is happening. That is true journalism. Number 2, resistance to me is an act of reclaiming the public comments. It's asking the question, who is we the people? Is we the people only the 16% who are allowed to vote in the first election? Wealthy white men with land? And that has been our challenge. Once again, we don't need to live up to the promise of the American Constitution. There were no promises. These were challenges of how are we going to define we the people. If Catherine Ann Goddard published the Declaration, she gave it a return address. You know, we have John Hancock, and if you look below, it's Catherine Ann Goddard actually published it and gave us a return address. Baltimore, come and get me. And yet Catherine Ann Goddard could not have a voice in we the people. None of you women. And it's the women who buy the books. Just remember to atone, $24.99. Who are we the people? And I thought about it this week. I began my book tour in Arizona. And I wanted to be in Arizona because Arizona was Trump before Trump. And I've written another book. I went back in 2010 and followed the immigration battle. And I wanted to be with my young Latinos in Phoenix. We packed the bookstore. It was amazing. They were doing voter registration drive. And they said, hey, man, can you tell those guys on the East Coast, when Trump got elected in 2016, we brought down Sheriff Joe Arpaio. We brought down the tent camps that you're building today. That when SB 1070, the horror show me your papers immigration bill that Trump wants to do, he's following the playbook page by page. We recalled the state Senate president, Russell Pierce, and no media covered it. The first lady was in town when I was in town, and she was supposedly visiting an immigration center. And I wanted to talk about the first lady in 1943, when a first lady who should have been our president, Eleanor Roosevelt, came to Arizona and she visited the Japanese internment camps. She was shocked. She defied old Franklin. She said, we must close these camps, that they're abomination, that we cannot distinguish and break down our country based on race and religion. I mean, that baby, think of the timing, she understands. And that Eleanor Roosevelt was responding to the case of Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu was a holy roller from Oakland. He was a tennis star. He went to the Pentecostal church. He had a beautiful Italian girlfriend, but they couldn't be seen in public because of the racial laws in California. And when the war broke out, he volunteered, I want to go fight. And they wouldn't take him because he had flat feet. And after Pearl Harbor, the military order came in, and his parents and he, along with 110,000 Americans and Japanese residents, were told to report to a bus in a plaza, and they would be taken to camps. Fred refused as a young man. He said, I'm an American. This is not right. This is against my constitutional rights. He got a job in the stockyards. He still went out with Alida. He tried to become an American. He had a botched plastic surgery on his eyes. He walked the streets. He said, I'm not going to go along with this. I am right. And of course, they arrested him when they were coming out of the theater one night. He was put into jail. ACLU would not take his case, so the local ACLU and other lawyers took it on. They went through the first courts, the appellate courts, the appeal courts. They went to the Supreme Court, and there the Supreme Court ruled that in a time of war, we have a right to intern Americans. Fred didn't give up. And there was plenty of resistance in our internment camps. And I think we tend to think that the Japanese Americans were doormats, but in fact, there were sit-ins, there were work stoppages, there were all sorts of resistance. And they shunned Fred, though, because he was considered a troublemaker. The war is over. He, of course, lost Alida. He went back. He married someone else. He had a regular life. But it burned in him that I'm right. They broke my constitutional rights. Well, you don't break your rights. What is the word? They took my right as an American. They ignored. And finally, in 1950, we threw out the law. And believe it or not, President Nixon rescind the order and apologize, and President Ford actually had a commission. But it wasn't until 1983 that a federal commission found a secret document working with Fred's attorneys that found that the military had lied. They had said, you know, the Japanese are inherently militant and violent, and therefore we have to intern them because they're going to attack us domestically. Not a single domestic attack ever happened. And that secret document, which had been fabricated, was used, and we apologized. But he was still guilty on the books. And Fred went to his deathbed saying, I was right. And last week, when our Supreme Court passed the ban on people who come from largely Muslim countries, it was shocking to me that what wasn't reported in the news media was a tiny little paragraph where our justice said, please don't confuse this with the Korematsu case. We all know that was wrong. In fact, we are going to throw that case out because Fred Korematsu was done wrongly, and the court of history will judge us that this was an inhumane act. The cruel irony of here now they're separating us and banning our travel, but they held up the resistance that this Supreme Court today, which will get even uglier in the next few weeks, said Fred Korematsu's resistance was right. And to me, that is Fred reclaiming this public commons. And that is the role of resistance, to say it's not a matter about voting, it's not a matter about protesting, it's a matter of asserting who we are as we the people, that I have a right to speak, and I have a right to invoke who we are in our democracy. Number 3, the resistance to me is finally a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for our country. In that dark time of Sarin in 1981, nobody got that joke. I'll try it again. In that dark time of Ronald Reagan in 1981, Ronald Reagan referred to Nelson Mandela as a communist agent. Ronald Reagan refused to put sanctions on apartheid when the rest of the world was doing it. I still fly into National Airport. I don't know about you. Yes. All right. And so in the 1980s, I was working in New York City at Riverside Church, and we followed Trans-Africa. And every day we came down and we blockaded the doors of the South African embassy day in and day out for over 400 days to say, we need to put sanctions and bring down apartheid. And after South Africa got their liberation, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just like North Carolina did after one of their riots, that white people would come up and talk about the crimes they committed. Just as you had in Nazi Germany, a museum admitting and showing and documenting the crimes they had committed, that we have never had in our country. How do we begin this process of not just resisting, but healing our nation and bringing our nation together if we're not even going to recognize and reconcile with our own history? That an African-American youth the same age as my 16-year-old kid has a 10 times greater chance of being brutalized by the police and incarcerated. And these are the kind of stories I try to put in the resistance. And I have to go back to history. We have to go back to our beginnings. And I go back to George Washington, don't know his middle name. In 1789, he's being inaugurated in Washington. And it was beautiful because the inauguration was down on Wall Street. What a better imagery was that for the photographer of those days. These beautiful paintings, and there's George Washington in New York City where we had our first capital, and George Washington is talking about we're finally free, and the patriots love to use the metaphor of slavery. Now we're free from slavery. Not realizing he had hundreds of slaves back home. All of the founding fathers, except for His Highness. And there in the audience was a young woman who had put on Martha Washington's dress that day. She was an enslaved American. Her name was Ona Judge. She was At a status even below a slave, she was referred to as a dowry slave, which means you would never get your freedom because when your so-called property owner died, they would pass you on down to the next person in the family. And Ona heard these words of freedom. Oh, this grand inauguration in 1789, this beautiful celebration of freedom. Now we're a new nation. And she began to think and work with people in the community. When our nation's capital was moved from New York City down to Philadelphia, Ona went with them. And there in the land of abolitionists, the land of these great anti-slavery Quakers, she began to meet with different free African Americans and other people who talked about her, what was going on in the nation and the abolitionist movement. And of course, Thomas Paine was the only person who didn't even have slaves at that point. But even Thomas Paine, who's my hero, refused to deal with the abolitionist movement. Ona did. Ona embraced the resistance for her own. And in 1786, she realized, there was a nasty law that was passed for Congress. It said, in Pennsylvania, you're not supposed to have slaves, but we passed a law that if you take them out every 6 months and bring them back in, you can keep them. And so George Washington, like clockwork, would take his enslaved workers back to Mount Vernon and then bring them back. In 1786, Ona knew she was a year away from being given away to the granddaughter. So one night, she served the dinner in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, city of liberty, brotherly love. She thanked them. She said, bon appetito. She went back into the kitchen. She opened the door. She walked to the docks. She jumped on a boat. She took a schooner to New Hampshire, and she liberated herself. That, in fact, the chef of George Washington had gone before her. That, in fact, so many, 3-to-1 patriots. I'll take that back. 3-to-1 loyalists who fought for the British amongst African Americans. It was a 3-to-1 black African Americans who fought for the loyalists, in fact, instead of the patriots, because they had been promised freedom. The Ona judge gets to New Hampshire, and there, within 1 week, our president, he just didn't put it on Twitter, he put an ad in the newspaper looking for his fugitive. Think about that. In the city of brotherly love. And George Washington was obsessed with Ona Judge. He sent his son-in-law to go up and try to get her, and the New Hampshire senator hid her. And in fact, everyone helped her, and she married a sailor. And of course, as we know from Moby Dick, so many African-American sailors, Moby Dick was based on an African-American captain, that so many African-Americans went into seafaring. And she had this amazing life, even though she went through poverty. And 40 years later, she finally gave an interview to an abolitionist newspaper. And they said, how did it feel to be a fugitive all these years from George Washington, who to his dying day tried to capture her? And Ona said, I'm not a fugitive. I liberated myself. I am free and always will be. And that is part of the resistance, that if we are going to tell the full American story, we have to tell these stories of people who've been left out, of what we call historicide, people who've been erased from our history. That the resistance is not simply fighting against what's going on in this system today. It's about filling in and realizing there's this long continuum of resistance that we're standing on today. This extraordinary, rich treasury of unsung, unknown people who have defied the nation. People like Marie Equi, this beautiful Italian doctor who worked in Portland, and the judge referred to her as some weird woman because she was an openly lesbian doctor in 1916, and she was anti-war, and she would march against World War I, and she worked to give away birth control, and she was this amazing figure in Portland. And we passed a Second Sedition Act in 1918 to shut up any dissent against the war. The great President Wilson, meeting for the League of the Nations while he was putting his own League of the Nations in prison. And on the same day, Eugene Debs, our great socialist leader, was imprisoned. We didn't talk about it, but Marie Equi was arrested. And on the day that women won the right to vote, Marie Equi entered prison for a year. And she said, no man is going to tell me what to do. She served her term and came out and continued the resistance in Portland. And these are fundamental stories of historicide we have to erase. and bring back. We have to talk about, if you're going to talk about abolitionists, you have to talk about Maria Stewart, a black feminist in 1833 who gave this spellbinding address in Boston, who said, "Do you understand what white supremacy is? That we build the mansions and you live in it? That we cultivate and harvest the fruits and you eat it?" Who said, if we look at the role of Ruth and other women in the Bible who are important, why are women left out today? This extraordinary woman who was lost in history, the same kind of person like William Apis, a Native American leader in that same Boston period, someone who had grown up in a really difficult time in New York and then Massachusetts as a Pequot Indian. And in 1833, he worked with the indigenous group called the Mashpee in Cape Cod. And there on July 4th, 1833, they declared independence using our Declaration of Independence, saying, we as the Mashpee have a right to determine our own natural resources. Because white people were coming in and cutting their timber. Amazingly, the Massachusetts legislature recognized their rights. But when white people came in to cut down the trees and Apis confronted them, he was arrested. And so on July 5th, 1833, he was put in prison and he said, there is nothing you can do to damage me. I have my conscience. You can penalize me all you want. You can imprison me all you want, but I believe in my conscience. And there was a young boy going to Harvard in 1833 who read this in the newspaper. It was a huge news. His name was Henry David Thoreau. So he must have been important, like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Thoreau, who would go 15 years later and write, of course, the great civil disobedience that would change our society and influence Martha King and Gandhi and the rest of us. We never talk about the fact that he learned this from a Native American who was imprisoned. And this is how we reverse this historicide and how the resistance plays a role in giving stories to our democracy today. And that is what's happening now with Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, telling who is being left out when we talk about this raging economy today and stagnant wages. That is about so many people we don't know about. And that, to me, is the resistance. Finally, you all are looking really serious right now. Are we doing okay? Yes. All right. I mean, the baby's doing great. Finally, I want to talk about resistance as an act of renewal. Thomas Paine. You know, Thomas Paine is amazing. For $24.99, you can hear about that. And I want to warn you, people in the front, you know, when you're racing to get the book and a lot of copies for your grandkids, don't bump people with these chairs to get out of the way. Just let's make room for plenty of people to get the book. All right. We have it in our power to invent the world again. What a powerful phrase. That we're not simply going to follow what the English Constitution was. We're not going to do what other countries are. We have come here for a reason. One of the most amazing documents Thomas Paine wrote that we've completely overlooked is a letter he wrote to the Abbé Renewal, who was a French writer, who said basically that American Revolution was all about unhappy people and taxes. And Tom Paine said, actually it wasn't Tom Paine, he hated to be called Tom Paine, Thomas Paine, said, no, you don't understand. We were transformed by our American Revolution, that we are now going to put aside our prejudices, that we now are going to create a new nation. And so there was the meeting in Paris, the famous Paris Accords in 1782, when the United States met with Great Britain and we hammered out our freedom. And Thomas Paine wrote this letter at that time. He told the leader, a shaggy-haired guy with a mess of orange hair, he said, put aside your arrogance and join the rest of the world. Thomas Paine wrote in this beautiful letter that we must join the temple of science, and science should determine the decisions of the nations. That in fact, when we became Americans, we became a part of the world, and every decision we made should be made in sync with the rest of the world. We shall all meet in the temple of philosophy and put aside our differences. That there was no America first. That the true America that he defined, the man who gave us the United States of America, said it was to be part of the world. And 235 years later, President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accords of climate. There's not a single statue of Thomas Paine in Washington, D.C. There's not a single monument to Thomas Paine outside of a tiny one where he was given a farm in New York and then denied the right to vote in 1806 when he came back. This man who helped lead the French Revolution, this man who is wanted dead or alive as a fugitive in England, this man who was more important than Che Guevara. He was just this fascinating character. There's not even a movie on Tom Paine because he wrote a book that attacked religion, saying we should think for ourselves in an age of reason. He became a persona non grata, and he died anonymously, and 2 African Americans attended to his funeral. There's not a single monument to Tom Paine in Washington, D.C., even if Congress in 1993 set aside money to build one. There are 7,000 monuments to the Confederates in the United States, including 3 in Arizona, and they weren't even a territory then. And I don't know who did it, but someone tarred and feathered those monuments, and I think that's a great idea. So let's finish with this. Tom Paine said, resistance is an act of renewal, to reinvent. And we talk about climate, and we talk about climate change. And the Paris Accords today are as important as the Paris Accords in 1782. And we look at today with rising temperatures, and we look at the inaction and a lobby that is completely controlling Washington of coal and oil and gas, and nothing is not only being done, but it's being reversed. You know, Trump even wants to bankroll and add even more welfare to the coal companies who already get about $28 billion of your tax dollars. And so how do we begin to resist this? Is to do what Tom Paine and say we have it in our hands to reinvent the world and have cities of resistance. That 68 cities across the United States have declared within 10 years they're going to be 100% renewable energy. That they begin to see your city as a regenerative city, that what you consume is what you produce, that instead of importing your electricity from natural gas or the horrible coal-fired plant that we fought for years and finally got off the Capitol, that we begin to generate the electricity needs ourselves. In Iowa, where I'm exiled right now, we produce 40% of our electricity from wind. I saw this great billboard driving through Appalachia coming in here. I mean, only in Appalachia. And I'm just a proud hillbilly, and I've written so much about Appalachia, but these billboards, it was, the wind dies and the sun goes to bed. You know, only coal is clean. I thought, man, whoever came up with that, genius. So how do we think of cities of resistance as regenerative cities? That Washington, D.C., if you live in Washington, D.C., and probably some of you even live, God forbid, in Maryland or Virginia. But we begin to say we're going to now look at our individual communities and commit that we're not going to worry about the Paris Accords. We're going to do the Paris Accords. That 70% of the carbon emissions come from our cities. So who cares what's happening on 16 Pennsylvania Avenue? That 93% of your food is imported in Washington, D.C. Just like Adelaide, Australia, a city of 1 million people down below, who said, what are we doing? We don't have water for this. The carbon footprint. These strawberries don't taste like strawberries anymore. These tomatoes don't taste like tomatoes anymore. And they ring the city with thousands of acres of urban farms because we can't all do it in our backyards. And they began to support young farmers. And they began to say, hey, you got to feed the food. So we're going to enact compost laws, just like San Francisco and Seattle, where you get fined if you don't compost. And we're going to do like Boulder, Colorado, and have an 85% zero waste policy. That we don't just recycle our beer bottles after drinking heavily on a Friday night, but we actually reuse and divert the waste. We stop with energy. And now Adelaide, Australia, a city of 1 million down under, produces 43% of its own food. It's brought into urban markets where neighborhoods have gone one by one, 100% renewable. There's a solar bus going down the main drag of Adelaide. They have planted 3 million trees for carbon sequestration. They have reduced their carbon emissions by 32%, even as their economy has increased by 28%. That's a city of resistance, because they said, we have it in our power to invent a new world. And that, to me, is why I wrote this book for $24.99. So on a serious note, which I tend to do about 5 minutes a day, my son came to me when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, my 12-year-old son. And assuming he was going to hit me up for some money to go. And he said, hey, Daddy, I want to ask you a question. I saw Trump pulled out of the climate accords. And I said, yeah. And he knows that's one of my beats to write about. And he said, is there any hope? Is there any hope for my future? And you're holding that baby, Courtney. And how do you look at that baby and be glib? How do you look at that baby when we know what is happening with climate change? How do I look at my son and say, yeah, just go do recycling or something. Just be nice to your friend. When we know that's not true. And I can't even be super glib with my son because, thanks to my wife, he's an Italian citizen as well. And he knows the resistance because of his grandparents means taking up weapons against the Nazis and the fascists. And so we can't be cavalier with the word resistance with him. How do you look to the young people today and tell them the truth? And that was a hard thing for me. I wanted to sermonize about climate change. I wanted to give them a big story about Adelaide, Australia. Did you know in Adelaide down below they've got... And here's this 12-year-old kid, big eyes. Is there any hope? And I had to come back to Washington. When I was 21, 1985, we're blocking those doors to the South African embassy. And I realized that Nelson Mandela had been in prison more than I had been on this planet. And we had President Reagan, the Teflon president, we couldn't take down. And we get arrested, and I'm in the jail cell. And it's one of those typical Washington, chic arrests because nothing happens, and it's just run of the mill, and we're sitting in our jail cell, and I'm thinking, this is useless. It's hopeless. We can't stop apartheid. And my cellmate was my boss at that point. His name was William Sloan Coffin. And Bill, he's Reverend Sloan in Doonesbury. And he's got this, he's one of those larger-than-life guys with this great New York accent, and he had studied with Boulanger in Paris, and then he had been a secret agent in the war and founded the CIA, and then he, had a moment of awakening, and he goes to Yale, because people with three names all go to Yale, and then he comes back, and he's this great, religious leader at Yale as a chaplain. But he was also the first white preacher to join the Freedom Rides, which I didn't know. And Bill said, Jeff, I learned something in 1961 from a young African-American sitting in the jail cell of Alabama. Bill was a tough guy, and when they were beaten up at the Freedom Rides, he was ready to fight back. I mean, he was a military hero. And the African-American said, what are you doing, man? That's not part of our campaign. We go to jail. We're going to resist. We're going to win this, but on our terms. And Bill was sitting in jail, and this African-American, he's all fidgety, and he said, listen, man, hopelessness adapts, but hope resists. And Bill looked to me and said, hope resists. And that's what I told my son. Hope resists. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I thought you were running off to get a bunch. She was like racing to the front of the line to buy books.
No. I was going to ask a question. I mean, this was all very exciting, and it's nice to know about history, but we're here now, and you haven't really given us a good roadmap other than, one person doing something heroic. What did you tell them in Appalachia? Appalachia, when I was growing up, was a very liberal place. And I spent a summer working for the mine workers in 1972 or 73, when it was after Tony Boyle had gone to jail and when the mine workers were being reinvented. And it was really very exciting.
All right, I'm going to tell you what I told them, because these are my people.
Right.
I grew up with coal miners. I saw my grandfather die from black lung disease. My family lost our strip mine. I've been fighting in Appalachia for decades. And so what I told you tonight in the roadmap is easy. I'm not here to give you a prescription. I'm here to give you a vision. And that vision that each person has, what we learned with our hillbillies, is that you have to be a catalyst. And so this is going to tie into what you tie. You know, in 1955, down in Montgomery, Alabama, and I talk about history and it responds today, so just have some patience with me. A young African-American woman, she was young because she's a lot younger than I am, and I'm still young. She was the secretary of the NAACP, a labor leader, and she had just done a freedom exhibit. She said, the problem here in the status quo is I don't trust white people. And they say, you need to go up to Eastern Kentucky and talk to those hillbillies, Eastern Tennessee at the Highlander Folk School that I was trained at. And she said, well, I'm not going up there. And they said, yes, you understand, since 1932, they're integrated. They've been working and training farmers and laborers. They integrated the first school in the South. And she finally went up there. And she couldn't believe that white men were working with black women washing plates and serving the food. And she said, how do you hillbillies do it? Black and white are eating together here in the backwoods. And Miles Horton, head of the Highlander Folk School, said, well, I don't know. We just cook the food, we put it on the table, and we ring the bell. And Miles, at the end of his workshop, said, you at the microphone, what is your role? You have to be a catalyst for change. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But you know what we're up against. And we're here together, all of us in this room, all of us in this community across the nation as part of the resistance. And the resistance is not a singular word. It's multi-movements. It's people who write checks. It's people who get arrested. It's people who are registering voters. It's people who are talking to their grandkids. But most importantly, how are you going to be a catalyst for change? And Rosa Parks was that student. And she went back to Montgomery. And 4 months later, she launched the Montgomery bus boycott. She didn't get trained by Highlander like I did. But she realized for the first time, she said, I've met white people I trust. I know someone has my back. So how do we take that history today? That has been my role over 8 books, to take our history as a how-to book, as Studs Terkel talked about my books. To take our history and realize, if you're a journalist today, you look back to the Sedition Act and we go and we take on Trump. And that's part of our blueprint of bringing the truth out of the shadows and becoming great writers and telling stories and not appeasing and not backing down like the New York Times did. The New York Times banned their journalists from having any personal comments on Twitter. And I couldn't believe that. I'm like, that's against the ethics of a journalist. We have a right to our opinions. We know the difference between the editorial page and the advertisement page. We know how to investigate stories. And that's part of our blueprint. If you're a person in the community, part of your blueprint is to make sure we're all part of we the people. And therefore, we're going to work against this immigration bill. We're going to make sure there's a decent bill, that DACA kids are included along with 11 million undocumented people, that people who've been banned because of largely Muslim areas, we're going to confront that and have sanctuary communities, sanctuary cities, sanctuary schools, just like Tom Paine said. That's part of the blueprint. And the third part I said is that we're going to talk about how we reverse this historicide. And we make sure that African Americans are in front now, that the women are in front, as we learned from the Women's March and the Me Too movement, that the Parkland student kids are teaching us, that people like me need to step back and allow other people a seat at the table of power. And that was the beauty of what we saw in the Bronx, wasn't it? This young, vivacious, wonderful woman, Alessandria, who won and upset an establishment Democrat, a 28-year-old woman who now will be coming to Congress. That's part of our blueprint. And finally, the most important is you're using a microphone that burns fossil fuels, that burns in my heart, because in Appalachia, not only have we been destroyed from coal mining, but now they are coming to take our natural gas. And they're fracking our communities. And once again, 2,000 miles of our streams, the headwaters of the East Coast, you can't even drink and be near. That we have cancer corridors. That still today, because of this electricity, 3 coal miners die every day from black lung disease. That's your blueprint. So your question you should ask is, how are you going to be a catalyst for change? Are you with me? All right.
All right, thank you. We are over time, so unfortunately we can't take any more questions. So let's give another round of applause for Mr. Biggers.